Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching History Resummarized: The Age of Augustus by Overly Sarcastic Productions. Now, we've watched a lot of videos on Augustus, or as he was called in his younger years, Octavian, but this seems like it'll be a fantastic summary of the entirety of his life. I mean, we've seen a couple of OSP videos before, and I've had a great time with all of them. So I'm excited to get into this one. Now, before I do, if you guys would like to see exclusive reaction content that I can't put on YouTube because of copyright reasons, then please check out the Patreon, which is linked down below. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
The Age of Augustus.
All right.
Part 1. All right, Caesar's dead. So, where do we go from here?
What a way to start!
Let's do some history and find out. If you were one of the handful of senators that had just forcibly perforated your dictator, your first move would be to get the Pluto out of town.
And by the way, as we saw, it really was just a handful. Now, there was a good number of senators involved in the plot to assassinate Caesar, but the number of senators who actually stabbed Caesar was pretty low, and the number of senators who stabbed Caesar while he was alive and fighting was even lower. Most of the stab wounds came from guys who sort of, sauntered in afterwards and gave Caesar a little jab. But there was a pretty small number of men who actually murdered Caesar. Of course, the rest were involved, they were complicit, but it really was a small number who did the deed itself.
See, the assassins thought that they were about to restore Rome to the full glory of the Republic, but they didn't count on Caesar's massive popularity among the Roman people. Needless to say, they didn't quite get the warm welcome and round of applause they were hoping for, so Brutus, Cassius, and some others pulled a Pompey and hightailed it to Greece to build.
Yeah, I think the conspirators were very naive. They somehow thought that they could assassinate Caesar and everything would go back to the way it was. We would restore the glorious Roman Republic. Now, of course, there was fighting amongst the conspirators. They debated over how far they should go. Should they just assassinate Caesar? Should they assassinate Caesar and Mark Antony, maybe Lepidus? Should they do an entire regime change? In the end, they went with sort of the least expansive option, just going for Caesar himself. And of course, it didn't work. I mean, that seems fairly obvious to me, and I'm sure some of the conspirators knew that, but a lot of the conspirators, led primarily by Brutus, were of the belief that if they managed to take out Caesar, they could return to the old Republican ways. Very naive, not to mention, they really didn't understand how popular Caesar still was. Now, Caesar had been becoming an authoritarian, and the people didn't like that, We've seen a lot of Caesar's actions, which were bringing him closer to becoming what might be a king, and the people of Rome did not like that. But Caesar had done a lot of popular things. He had passed a lot of reforms, a lot of policy that had helped the Roman people, and the populace hadn't forgotten about that. And so when they executed Caesar, when they assassinated him, the people were really not pleased. So I think the conspirators were rather naive and also didn't quite understand the situation that they were in and that Rome was in.
Build an army. Back in Rome, Caesar's corpse was still sitting there all squidgy-like on the floor of the Curia. Part of the Senate was gone, and most of what was still there didn't really like Caesar. So we had a power vacuum on our hands. The current consul Marcus Antonius, Caesar's trusted friend and ally, attempted to brand himself as Caesar's avenger against the assassins in order to rally the people to his side and fill that power vacuum. As consul, he was able to work out a compromise so that the assassins would be granted a general amnesty so long as Caesar's reforms stayed in place. The problem for him, like Caesar, was that even though the people liked him, the Senate, and Cicero in particular, very much did not. So
yes, we saw there was basically this compromise negotiated between the Caesarians, who at this point were led by Mark Antony. I mean, he was really the one who at first stepped up to take Caesar's place, between Antony, the Senate, and the conspirators. It was kind of complicated because the conspirators, of course, a lot of them were senators, but the Senate as a whole was in some ways sort of stuck in the middle. And so a compromise was worked out. Of course, in the long run, this compromise would not work at all. But in the immediate days following Caesar's death, it might have seemed like something was perhaps worked out. It very quickly became clear that nothing had been worked out, and the chaos would continue.
So after his consulship ended, Antony bailed to go be governor of Cisalpine Gaul. With Rome divided between dumpster fire and more overtly treasonous dumpster fire, let's leave all manners of fire behind us and jump over to Augustus, who at this point was named the rather less august Gaius Octavianus after his father. For clarity, historians refer to the pre-imperial Augustus as Octavian instead. Octavian was the great-nephew of Julius.
And it's worth remembering that we use a couple of different names for Octavian. These are sort of later names that we use, not necessarily what he would have been called at the time. So we call him Octavian, and then we call him Augustus. So it's just worth keeping in mind, and we do that for a lot of historical figures. The names that we use to describe people, and that we need to use for, I think, the sake of clarity oftentimes, are not necessarily what they would have went by, or what the people around them would have known them as.
Caesar, and they were decently close despite not being biologically related. At the time of the assassination, he was studying astronomy in Epirus, and after learning that Caesar had died, Octavian rushed back to Rome. Upon reaching Italy, he read Caesar's will and promptly acquired the single most valuable thing that Caesar could possibly have given him: his name. From that day on, Gaius Octavianus was known to everyone as Gaius Julius Caesar, the officially adopted heir to the big man himself, and that was huge.
Gaius Julius Caesar, but if we were to call him Gaius Julius Caesar, it might get a little bit confusing. But they're exactly right. Caesar passed down the most important thing he had, his legacy. Now, he also passed on a lot of other things to Octavian, but the most important was that he appointed Octavian as his heir. This was Caesar telling everybody, posthumously, in his will, that when I'm gone, I want my power, my authority, my legacy to go to Octavian. Not Mark Antony, not Lepidus, but Octavian. And so that was a big boost to the young man.
So now Gaius, Little Caesar's Octavian, and Mark, all bang anything that moves and drink whatever does Antony, were both in the race to become Caesar's avenger against the assassins. This was important for both of them because that role would entail not only glory, but a buttload of power. The short of it is that...
Oh yeah. And though we just saw Octavian being basically appointed as Caesar's heir by Caesar himself, you know that didn't stop Mark Antony. Now, this was a massive boost to Octavian, but these are a bunch of authoritarians fighting for power and their own personal fiefdom, basically. And so, the will of Caesar, that's not going to stop Mark Antony. Now, it presents a lot of problems, because now, perhaps Octavian has a little more legitimacy than he does, but they're both going to keep going in their own direction. And at times they'll be allied, and at times they'll fight amongst each other.
Octavian was successful in this because he was a brilliantly crafty manipulator of iconography and cultural symbolism, and he even convinced all of Rome that Caesar had become a god. The next handful of political movements are honestly needlessly complicated, but the gist is that most people just wanted to be on the winning side regardless of which side that was, so the alliances were almost constantly shifting. Octavian was probably the one encouraging Cicero to give all those angry speeches against Antony, and then after Antony...
Yep, and we saw this in our Historia Civilis reactions. There was a very complex network of alliances that were constantly changing. At this point, we basically had an alliance between the Senate, led by Cicero, and Octavian, and even the conspirators to a certain extent against Mark Antony, who appeared like the biggest threat to all of them. So, a very sort of confusing mix of alliances there, and of course they would eventually break down, but we do see a sort of partnership emerge between Octavian and Cicero. Now, one could argue that was a little naive from Cicero, because, of course, he teamed up with one authoritarian to beat another, but one could also argue that Cicero did not have much of a choice with the position he was in. It's all very complicated, and, we've done several videos on this whole political mess that's going on.
Antony skipped town and went north, he had to wrestle the governorship from another one of Caesar's assassins. The Senate, being markedly anti-Caesar, sided with the current governor and against Antony and declared him an enemy of the state. The Senate wanted to send a legion or two to deal with Antony, but they didn't have an army. Octavian, however, had promised Caesar's veterans that he could pay them if they remained loyal to him. So Octavian, interestingly, buddied up with the Senate to go fight Antony, which on paper makes no sense because you know the whole Caesar's Avenger business. In practice, however, Octavian was very pragmatic, and
this is exactly the point I made. You might think, well, that doesn't make any sense for the Senate led by Cicero or for Octavian, but both were trying to be practical, and in practice, this alliance appeared to make sense at the time.
If helping the anti-Caesar Senate fight the pro-Caesar Antony seemed politically expedient for him, you bet he'd do it in a heartbeat. As such, Octavian and the two consuls that year marched up to Mutina against Antony. Octavian's senatorial army won, but both consuls were killed in the battle. When the Senate asked Octavian to give up his army, he said, that's a good one. No.
And a note there, he marched up with the two consuls. When I say the Senate led by Cicero, I'm not necessarily saying that Cicero was consul. But at this point, you know, a lot of positions were basically unofficial, so whoever was consul didn't matter as much as who actually held the power, right? Who actually held the power were the conspirators, Octavian, Mark Antony, and Cicero. He really was the leader of the Senate at this point, in all but name. Maybe not officially, but the Senate followed his lead, and he did a lot of the top-level negotiating with people like Octavian.
And allied with Mark Antony to march on Rome with 8 legions and politely request that the Senate declare him consul or else. And they did. With the Senate's begrudging compliance, Mark Antony hopped over to Spain to meet up with his Caesarian political ally Marcus Lepidus. Meanwhile, anybody remember Pompey? You know, first triumvirate, fought a civil war with Caesar, decapitated on an Egyptian beach? Yeah, that guy. So the Senate granted Pompey's son Sextus command of the Republic's entire navy and Sicily to use as a base. Also, Brutus and Cassius were happily serving as governors of Macedonia and Syria, respectively.
I mean, just look how freaking complicated this is. We have the Roman Senate. Then we have Octavian, who was supposed to be an ally of the Senate, but has just marched on the city of Rome. We have Mark Antony and Lepidus out west, you know, the sort of former Caesarians doing their own thing. We have Pompey's son, who's been given control of the Roman navy, and of course, he's looking out for himself. Then we have the conspirators, Brutus and Cassius, out east, building their own independent power base. I mean, it's just an absolute mess. Like I said, it's basically a bunch of powerful strongmen with their own personal fiefdoms that they are currently building.
Effectively just doing their thing, having fun, building up their armies, all that jazz. The Senate got a really great deal out of that amnesty agreement. Following the misunderstanding up at Mutina, Octavian buddied up with Mark Antony and his friend Lepidus to form the Triumvirate Publicae Constituendi. In English, the triumvirate for the reconstitution of the Republic.
Second triumvirate.
In smaller words, the 3 guys for making Rome not have a civil war again team. Unlike the first triumvirate, which was an informal political alliance between Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar, the second triumvirate, created by plebiscite, was a legally recognized entity that gave each triumvir full dictatorial power, so everything they said or did was law. Now, what exactly reconstituting the Republic meant was up for debate, but
I mean, this is basically splitting up the empire amongst these 3 men. You could say they are a bit ahead of their time. Of course, Rome will be broken up several times in the future, and one of those times will be permanent. But, you know, we have the Roman Republic, dead at this point, I suppose. Well, there are arguments to be made. Its corpse is basically festering. Some people are still pretending that it's alive, but it's pretty clear to anybody with a set of eyes that the Roman Republic is gone at this point. And so we have these 3 men who are just splitting it up amongst each other and saying, yeah, so in my territory, I have dictatorial power. Is that good with you two? And the other 2 say, yeah, sure. And everybody else in Rome goes, hey, what the hell? What happened? What are we doing? This is not Republican at all. But what are your other options, right? You have a rather weakened Roman Senate. You have Sextus Pompeius, the boat king, who's sailing around, conquering, blockading. And then you have the conspirators out east who aren't really much better, or any better, right?
But as far as the triumvirate was concerned, the most important matter was taking care of Brutus and Cassius in the east, and financing the armies necessary for that would have been quite expensive. The Senate would likely have disagreed with this because, in their eyes, the formation of the triumvirate was nothing more than the plebeian assembly handing over Rome to a few Caesarinos playing dictator. So the triumvirate had to contend not only with the remote threat of the assassins, but also with local hostility in the Senate. To solve this conundrum, they split the difference and killed all of them. The triumvirate pulled
I also think that at this point, if you were living through this, it really must have seemed like Rome was basically over. Like Rome had been split up. You have a very common sort of cycle happening here, which is you have one powerful strong man, Caesar, and when he dies, the empire gets split up amongst his successors, and that's exactly what's happening. The idea that in years from this point, the empire would be reunited under Rome's first emperor, a great and powerful emperor, I imagine that would probably have been pretty difficult to believe with all of the chaos of this period.
Page out of Sulla's book and drafted up a hit list of Rome's enemies, which conveniently contained about 300 wealthy anti-Caesarian senators and some 2,000 landowners in Rome. The
conscriptions, this was called, extremely brutal, and they laid it out exactly right. You put up a public hit list, these are the people who we want murdered, or officially it's, hey, you can murder these people scot-free. Won't get punished for it. And of course the message is, hey, murder these people. That would be good. And so not only do you have what is basically a mass purge, a mass political purge, but it also creates this sort of environment of chaos and violence where people who probably wouldn't be murdering otherwise are now given free rein to run around and kill people whose names have been written up on this list. This video is about Octavian, of course, so I'll frame it in that light. Definitely a low point for Octavian. Octavian could be a rather brutal leader. Not always, but he certainly could be. And this, of course, is a very brutal action. Not unprecedented, as they mentioned, had been done before, but, pretty bad.
The kicker is that everyone's funds were confiscated when they were killed, so the triumvirate conveniently accumulated insane amounts of money in the process of killing off all their political enemies. The prescription started with that initial 2,000 some odd people, but rapidly ballooned to double that. They gutted over a third of the Senate. This was obviously pretty messed up. I mean, it worked, but geez, they killed Cicero and hanged his head up in the Forum. There's no way that...
And the process of writing up these conscription lists was fascinating because you basically have to compromise amongst the triumvirate over who you do or don't want killed. That's a pretty crazy thing to compromise over. So, for example, Octavian, who we might remember, was once an ally of the Senate, an ally of Cicero's, and had a good relationship with Cicero, did not want Cicero murdered, but Lepidus, and especially Mark Antony, pushed for Cicero to be put on the list. Octavian didn't have much of a choice, so he agreed. So someone who he had a good relationship with, he liked by all accounts, he allowed to be murdered in cold blood. I mean, that's the sort of situation we're talking about here.
The triumvirate comes out of this not looking like murder tyrants. Civil war is one thing, but this was domestic slaughter. The next big event on the docket for the triumvirs was using their ill-gotten funds to finance a campaign against the assassins. Antony and Octavian led their armies into Greece and met Brutus and Cassius at Philippi. Antony defeated Cassius, who killed himself, and Brutus overran Octavian's camp. But conveniently, Octavian didn't die because for some reason he wasn't there. Suspicious. After that, Antony came back to Octavian's camp and defeated Brutus, who then killed himself. So the triumvirs win, but Antony did all of the hard work, and also Octavian had possibly bailed from the battle all...
Yeah, it's not suspicious. I feel like the way they framed that, you'd think something sneaky was going on. No, Octavian probably just bailed. I mean, look, we've talked about Octavian a lot on this channel, and you guys know that I'm not afraid to give credit where credit is due. I'm not afraid to criticize where criticism is due. And Octavian was not a military man. We know this. He first off, didn't like military affairs. He didn't want to be involved. And so any chance he got, he wouldn't be involved. Now, throughout his career, we're going to see the emergence of Agrippa, who will handle all of Octavian's military affairs, but Octavian didn't want to be there, and yeah, he probably just bailed. And so Mark Antony did all the hard work. Mark Antony, a man who I've criticized a lot, but did have talent in terms of military affairs. I will absolutely admit that. He was a good military leader. Mark Antony did all the work, and he got all the credit. Mark Antony leaves this battle on a pretty strong foot compared to Octavian.
Together. Forget the prescriptions. In the eyes of the Romans, Philippi was the biggest disgrace in Octavian's career. And you can see him trying to make up for it by representing himself through calculated military imagery for decades after the fact. After Philippi, the Republic was somewhat slightly reconstituted, and in the wake of a reconquered East and gutted Senate, the triumvirs were the biggest players in the Roman world, so they carved it up into East, West, and South. With Octavian taking Italy, Spain, Gaul, and Illyria, Antony taking Greece, Anatolia, Cyrenaica, and Syria, and poor old Lepidus getting Carthage and a little bit of the African coast. If you got the sense that Lepidus didn't matter, it's okay, because you are correct.
Yeah, it's true. I remember when we were doing those other videos, I was asking, Lepidus, it seems like he wasn't too influential, but there must be more to him. There isn't really more to him. He is given a pretty bad position. And as I said, after Philippi, Antony walks out on a strong foot. Octavian is a little weak comparatively, but over time, Octavian will build his power and build his position against Antony, expanding his territory. So this is basically an alliance between Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus, but Lepidus doesn't really matter, and Octavian and Antony are in a constant rivalry with each other. A rivalry that will, of course, erupt into warfare.
He did not. Poor Lepidus.
Yeah,
On
poor
paper,
Lepidus.
Things were peaceful and stable, but late Republican Rome being late Republican Rome, it really wasn't. I mean, two people, each controlling a third, half of the Roman world, each of whom was looking to follow Caesar's example of unilaterally ruling Rome. That's fine, right? Yeah, I'm sure they'll just be totally, perfectly fine.
Oh yeah,
no
fine.
Stress. Part 2.
All right.
In the wake of Caesar's assassination, Roman politics got even weirder than they were in the century beforehand, which, given the persistence and pervasiveness of civil war...
Yeah, and just to pause on this real quickly, we talked about this in OSP's video on the Roman Republic. Fantastic video, by the way. Even before Caesar, hops onto the scene and starts causing some real chaos and... basically brings the Republic into terminal decline. As I said, we're technically in the late Republican era, but the Republic is nothing more than a festering corpse at this point. You can see even before Caesar, look at all the strife and civil war that Rome was going through. I mean, it is clear that the Republic was incredibly unhealthy, vulnerable, and weak, which is one of the reasons why it was so easy for the war to break out between Caesar and Pompey, and so easy for Caesar to crown himself a king, maybe not a king, at the very least a strongman authoritarian. The Republic was not having a good time for, like I mentioned, basically 100 years prior.
Is really saying something. After the military success of the triumvirate, the collective Roman citizenry hoped really, really hard that it wouldn't immediately explode into another civil war. Well, bad news, boyos. The Roman Republic had been living on borrowed time for over a century by this point, so realistically, we're looking at 4, maybe 5 minutes tops before it all crashes down. Fun times, right? The period of peace after the defeat of the assassins and the gutting of the anti-Caesarian members of the Senate in the notorious proscriptions was an uneasy one, to say the least. Memories of several different battles fought, Italian fields burned and drenched in Roman blood, and family members killed were swirling in everybody's minds, so a lot of...
Oh yeah. I mean, look, we saw how chaotic the Republic was even before Caesar, but these last couple of years have been times of absolute chaos. I mean, Romans fighting against fellow Romans, brother against brother, territories that probably thought they were relatively secure, seeing immense levels of warfare and violence, towns being destroyed, fields being burned. Just a horrible, horrible couple of years for the Republic. So, imagine the state of mind that everybody's in. And from our perspective, of course, we know that very soon the Republic, or what's left of it, is going to descend into warfare again.
People were unconvinced that they were looking at a long-term solution. In poetry, this period is known as the Great Fear, when everyone was really anxious about civil wars. Fearful, you would say, and 100% certain that there would be more of them. Rome's greatest poets of the time, Horace and Virgil, both acutely touch on the constant fear felt by the populace. And as it happens, the poets were pretty much right about the big bad specter of civil war. In the East, Antony had been consolidating his power by striking up alliances with nearby monarchs in a bid to accumulate money and military power for his planned campaign into Parthia, but perhaps most importantly, he pulled a Caesar and sauntered over to Egypt to schmooze with Cleopatra. In the West, Octavian had a lot of problems. His land reforms got the sympathy of his legions, but proceeded to alienate the rest of Italy pretty handily, because that...
Well, Octavian went for the idea that would become a very popular idea throughout the Roman Empire, so you could say he's a bit ahead of his time, that the happiness of your army is more important than the happiness of the Roman people, right? He decided to basically take land and give it to his soldiers, obviously at the expense of everybody else who was holding that land. And while, of course, this is another authoritarian power grab, no respect for other people's property and livelihoods, to be honest, I do get where Octavian is coming from. He does need to please his army, because his army is the one institution, at least in his portion of the empire, that is capable of overthrowing him. Octavian and many emperors following him acutely knew this, and so above all else they tried to please their army. Now this would become a bigger and bigger problem throughout the lifetime of the empire, but you can kind of see the logic there.
That's kind of what happens when you confiscate people's land and give it to your army instead. In 40 BC, Antony's wife Fulvia led a revolt against Octavian and very briefly captured Rome. Octavian then pushed them out to Gaul and quashed the rebellion, after which he sacrificed 300 of the conspirators. Not imprisoned, not even executed, sacrificed.
Yes. And Mark Antony claims that, I didn't know about this rebellion, I wasn't involved. In reality, we don't know whether or not he was involved. There's a chance that, his family members acted on their own. Of course, there's a chance that he knew about it. There's even a chance that he might have ordered it, but we don't know.
Octavian performed human sacrifices on fellow Romans on the altar of the deified Julius Caesar. The ancient world was no stranger to animal sacrifices, but when it came to people, Romans did not do that. So,
Yeah, we've talked about this before. The Romans loved a good bit of animal sacrifice, but they abhorred human sacrifice. Now, we've looked at a couple of triumphs in the past where war prisoners, have been executed in front of religious temples during religious ceremonies. So I frankly think a couple of times the Romans got pretty close to human sacrifice, but even so, the Romans themselves would tell you, no, we don't do that. We are not into human sacrifice. So you can kind of see this is pretty unusual. This is sort of a big deal. Pretty odd.
I'm just gonna jot this up next to mass murder of wealthy Romans on the list of Octavian's deeply distressing personality quirks. Now, the golden rule of late Republican Rome is that anyone named Pompey is guaranteed to be a colossal pain in the butt for anyone named Caesar, and that's definitely the case here. Sextus Pompey, son of Pompey the Headless, had been tooling around in the Mediterranean for the better part of 8 years following Caesar's assassination, blockading ports and regularly cutting off Rome's food. Octavian was understandably
known as the Boat King, aka a pirate. That's basically what he was. He was building his own little island empire, as you can see, attacking shipments of whatever, mostly grain, and blockading the Italian peninsula. He was basically a pirate, though. A pirate with a large and well-armed fleet.
Miffed about this, but couldn't really do anything since Pompey had Senate-sanctioned control of Rome's entire navy. Even though the triumvirate was able to defeat the assassins a few years beforehand in a land battle, they were practically powerless against the only real navy in the Mediterranean. Technically, Egypt had a pretty great navy too, but they don't count because they're, not Roman, and also Cleopatra was solidly in Mark Antony's corner, so not about to help. Anyway, after a treaty broke down and Pompey inflicted a humiliating defeat on Rome, Octavian's general and all-around badass right-hand man Marcus Agrippa proceeded to take matters into his own hands by...
Now we have the emergence of Agrippa. Gone is the time of seeing Octavian try to handle battles, military stuff. He ain't good at it. And you know what? Credit to Octavian, if you're not good at something, you're not interested, and you're not getting any better, get someone else to do it for you. And that's exactly what he did. He found someone, his close friend Agrippa, who was far better at those things than he was. In fact, at the time, Agrippa might be one of, if not the most talented general the empire has. You know, you could debate, but yeah, a much better person to handle these type of things than Octavian.
By building up a navy of his own from scratch. The problem was that with Pompey controlling the seas, Agrippa's forces couldn't train how to sail in open waters without threat of being immediately murderized. So the madman digs a lake in the middle of Italy and uses it as a makeshift naval base to train up a fleet, which proceeded to demolish Pompey's navy because Agrippa is a military god.
Damn, okay, hey, they said it. He was certainly very talented, and as we can see here, one of the best traits of Agrippa was that he thought outside of the box. He was very intelligent and very creative. He was good at coming up with things that no one else would have thought of, using strategies that his enemies couldn't see coming, and faced with a situation where it doesn't seem like he has any options. How am I supposed to train a navy if, the Mediterranean is controlled by this pirate Sextus Pompeius? Well, you know what? Let's dig out and fill up a lake. There you go.
My headcanon is that Agrippa, equipped with nothing but a bucket, a shovel, and a mission, dug the whole lake himself in a night, though archaeology has yet to corroborate my hypothesis. Yet. After Agrippa's solo carry against Pompey, Lepidus attempted to seize Sicily for himself, but Octavian said, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, who let you leave the house?"
Yeah, well, that might be a little unfair framing for Lepidus. What happened is that Octavian and Lepidus basically jointly defeated Sextus Pompeius. It was a joint effort. That's why Lepidus was involved. It's just once he got involved, he thought, well, why don't I just take the place of Sextus Pompeius? I can be the new island king, right? And Octavian, of course, was very much not into that. And so now they come into direct conflict.
And immediately ejected him from the triumvirate, confining him to the priesthood. Was this, by any chance, legal? So then there were two. Moving on. Now, on paper, they were cool, because Antony had married Octavian's sister Octavia after his first wife Fulvia casually revolted against Rome.
On paper. But we can see both men building their bases of power. Antony's been at it for a while, building his power in the east. He's gotten very close to Cleopatra and Egypt. He's developing this whole restructure of the Roman East to center it around Egypt, around his base of power. Octavian, he's finally satisfied his soldiers by giving them land. He's gotten rid of Sextus Pompeius, who's been an annoyance for years, and he's taken the land of Lepidus. So both men are building up their bases of power, and, of course they're going to inevitably clash. Of course.
But in 32 BC, he divorced her and officially married Cleopatra, confirming what everyone in Rome already knew was happening for the better part of a decade. Observant viewers will recognize that not being in-laws anymore is the same step in the process when hostilities first flared up between Caesar and Pompey. So, get ready. It's around here that things start going downhill really fast. The Mediterranean was shaping to end in a violent showdown between the muscular military man Antony and the super scrawny strategist Octavian. 32 BC started off with the...
Yeah, well, fortunately Octavian had his own, buff military man Agrippa. But, the buff, coarse, vulgar military man Mark Antony, and the scrawny, sickly boy Octavian. And yet Octavian comes out on top because despite those aspects of his character, he was very intelligent, and in terms of politics, he certainly knew how to maneuver.
The year's two new consuls delivering what was apparently a devastating verbal smackdown against Octavian. The next day, Octavian showed up in the Senate with armed guards. This strong statement was also a gross violation of traditional rap battle protocol, after which part of the Senate bailed to go join up with Antony in the east.
Yeah, and I think most people would agree this was a mistake from Octavian, and I think he himself would have realized that. Octavian was clearly annoyed over what had been said. He wanted to reclaim the narrative. I don't think he realized that he was being so aggressive that part of the Senate would flee. We're seeing a rerun of Caesar versus Pompey. So I think Octavian sort of overstepped here, and I reckon he probably knew it. I don't think he meant for that to happen.
You'll have to forgive me. It's a little hard to hear with this massive echo in the history.
Yep.
For the senators, they found that Antony's half of the Republic was kind of suckish, so a few defected back to Octavian. But in the confusion, Octavian sneakily got a hold of Antony's will, which, among other things, included the neat little fact that Antony wanted to be buried in Egypt with Cleopatra.
And by sneakily, we mean he stormed a temple and seized it by force. I don't know how sneaky that is. Certainly sacrilegious, but Octavian has shown repeatedly that he does not really respect Roman traditions or religion or the Roman way of doing things, or at least he doesn't respect them if they get in the way of what he wants to do.
And he bequeathed entire Roman provinces to his children with her. Not only was this distinctly kingly behavior on his part, it was kingly behavior in service to a foreign state at Rome's direct expense. Octavian, of course, pounced on this like a cat on an expensive-looking vase and waged an intense propaganda war against Antony, branding him as having been bewitched by scary foreigner Cleopatra and forgetting how to be properly Roman. Octavian, by contrast, painted himself as the pinnacle of Romanness, as...
Yeah, Octavian waged a very successful propaganda campaign. Now, to be fair, he had a lot to work with. Antony's will looked really bad, and I think you can frame it as more or less bad, right? You can frame it as, Mark Antony is restructuring the Roman East, and he wants Egypt to be a Roman vassal. So he's not giving power away to Cleopatra and Egypt, he's just using them to assert Roman control over this new reorganized Roman East that he's developing, which will be more stable than the current Roman East. Of course, you can also frame it as Mark Antony being taken in by Cleopatra, and now he's giving away Roman provinces to foreigners. He's become Egyptian, he's no longer Roman. It's pretty easy to frame it that way, and that's exactly what Octavian did. He used a good bit of old-fashioned xenophobia, scary foreigners. Mark Antony, he's gone away. He's turned his back on Rome. He's turned towards Egypt. Pretty easy to frame it that way, and a lot of people bought that.
His family heritage traced back to the epic hero Aeneas and the settlement of Rome itself. Insofar as anyone could trace anything when it came to ancient genealogy. Coincidentally, just as soon as Antony's will was exposed, Octavian also began construction of a giant mausoleum right on the banks of the Tiber River in Rome. Bring on the propaganda fight. But perhaps the most important message that Octavian pushed was that Antony had become a slave to Cleopatra, by framing the problem as Antony was corrupted by this evil...
Alright, I gotta read this whole thing. So, Octavian's in the city of Rome itself, absolutely an advantage. Octavian could build statues and temples that the entire empire would hear about, but most of the Senate could see with its own eyes. We saw in some of our reactions how Octavian being in the city was a big advantage. As I said, he could build infrastructure. He sent Agrippa on a bit of a cleanup mission, clean up the sewers of Rome, build bathhouses. He can do things that'll really get the people of Rome on his side. The propaganda war had already been brewing, absolutely. Antony called Octavian a coward, poor military leader. Octavian responded by associating himself with military imagery, right? So we already saw how Octavian sort of had an embarrassing performance at Philippi. He knew it. I think a lot of people knew it. And Mark Antony, the strong military man, would of course play on that. And then Octavian talks about Antony, Eastern temptation, Cleopatra, Egypt. So this makes sense. And as we can see, Octavian, I think at this point, had an upper hand. Now, Octavian had been brutal and authoritarian at times, and I'm sure a lot of people didn't like him for that. He wasn't a military man, which was a disadvantage in comparison to Mark Antony, but at this point, Octavian has really built up his base of power. He's started to turn his reputation around. He's stopped with the political purges and started building bathhouses and temples, which the people tend to like a lot more. Not to mention, he has this document, Antony's will, which he can turn against him. So the propaganda battle has been going on for a while, but Octavian is a little more skilled at this sort of thing, and he's in a better position to take advantage and really pander to the people of Rome.
Evil foreign queen and her probably mind control boobs, he neatly avoided the touchy subject of civil war. Control over the narrative was key, and Octavian had it. When he entered into war with Antony in 32, all of Rome was convinced that the prime antagonist was Cleopatra.
Yep, and we can see Octavian's skillful twisting of the narrative. We're not fighting against Antony. No one wants another civil war, and I, Octavian, certainly don't want that. But what we do need to do is take down Cleopatra. She has bewitched Mark Antony. She's taking over the Roman East. She's a foreign aggressor. And the people are far more enthusiastic about a war against a foreign enemy than another civil war. Of course, this wasn't a war against a foreign enemy. Cleopatra wasn't in control in the East. You can have your opinion on to what extent she did or did not bewitch Mark Antony, but Mark Antony was in control. This was absolutely a fight against Antony.
And didn't think that Octavian was making a power play to seize the whole republic for himself. But no time to worry about the complex political implications of large-scale conflict, because off to war we go! And here, Octavian's controversial land redistribution scheme from a decade earlier paid dividends now that he was able to take the loyalty of several entire legions to the bank. Once again, Agrippa, my boy.
And that's why he did it. He wanted to secure the loyalty of his soldiers, and he felt at the time that was more important than securing the satisfaction of the people of Rome. He felt it was worth making people really dislike him even more in order to secure the loyalty of his men, and as they said, that's paying dividends now. Octavian realizes the importance of having fighting men who are loyal to you, specifically.
It comes in clutch. First, he prevented Antony from sailing from his base in Greece to Italy, which would have been a very bad time for Octavian and friends because Rome was not a long march away. After that, Antony and Cleopatra's armies set up camp at Actium in northwest Greece, with his supply chain running down to the Isthmus of Corinth and through to Egypt.
And we've seen the intelligent political maneuvering from Octavian, credit to him. And now we see Agrippa, of course, with the shades on, appropriate. This is a masterclass from Agrippa, a masterclass of military strategy. So, a good thing there's two of them, right? Octavian and Agrippa, absolutely talented in their own ways. Though Agrippa was pretty good at getting the people on his side, too. Octavian was the political guy, Agrippa was the military guy, and he's going to shine right here.
Agrippa, because awesome is his middle name, proceeded to intercept and cut off Antony's supplies at Corinth and then blockaded him in at the Bay of Actium, forcing a battle. While dozens, if not hundreds of poems have been written to commemorate Actium, I'm not sure there has ever been a bigger anticlimax in all of Roman history. Can I? Heartbreak. Zama? Drama. Everything Caesar did in Gaul? Mwah. Tactical brilliance. Actium? Meh. For how
Yeah, Caesar liked a bit of drama. Caesar versus Vercingetorix, the showdown. He liked a bit of drama. But this was an absolute masterclass from Agrippa. Agrippa forced Antony into a position where he either had to attempt to retreat overland back to Egypt, or he could try and fight this big naval battle. He decided to go with the big naval battle. He had really a difficult decision to make, and he probably made the better decision, but basically what had happened is Agrippa had forced him into a position where Antony didn't have a good option to go with. Now, maybe if Antony was incredibly brilliant, he could have figured out some third option to go with, but, we have Agrippa. He's the one who figures out the third option. Antony just has to decide which of the options Agrippa has presented him with to go with. And that's exactly what happened.
Consequential of a battle it is, it's shockingly uninteresting. All the actual cool stuff happened before the battle. Agrippa laid on the moves to force the fight, and then after that, Cleopatra and Mark Antony decided that leaving and losing was better than likely losing anyway, plus being captured and probably killed, because honestly fair. So they broke the blockade and bailed.
Yeah, and as we saw in our Historia Civilis reaction, there's been a lot of chatter, a lot of debate over to what extent this retreat was planned. Now, how it occurred is, Cleopatra basically started the retreat and Antony followed. So there's a lot of questions. Did they both plan this beforehand? Was Cleopatra abandoning the fight and Antony just decided to follow last minute? Was this something that Cleopatra had planned and Antony knew about? Was this something that they said, if the battle's going badly, then we flee? We really don't know what happened. I find it hard to believe, in fact, almost impossible to believe, that Antony didn't know something like this was being planned. I think it was pretty clear that Cleopatra intended to flee, or at least intended to flee when things were going badly. I think the question is more, to what extent was Antony involved, and to what extent did he plan to flee the whole time? We really don't know. There's a lot of questions remaining.
After the battle, everyone just went home. Octavian went back to Rome to tidy up the state and deal with the bread famine, and Antony and Cleopatra went back to Egypt, navyless but alive. The next year, Octavian came to a defenseless Alexandria. Sources are all over the place, but the general gist is that Antony killed himself. Octavian tried to get Cleopatra to come to Rome to be a set piece in Octavian's triple triumph, but Cleopatra pulled a Dido by giving Rome the finger through a dramatic suicide, which honestly is entirely valid. From Octavian's and, by extension, Rome's side of the story, Cleopatra looks one-dimensional and evil, but that is a woefully inaccurate characterization.
And historians since, haven't treated Cleopatra super well, but I think, particularly in more modern times, we've tried to give a more rounded view of Cleopatra, but that is work that has to be done by modern historians, because the sources we have, as they said, which are pro-Octavian sources, because that's sort of how history has often worked, particularly Roman history. The surviving sources from Octavian's reign, given he was so powerful, he was the victor in the end, or sources that are at least somewhat friendly to Octavian. So we have to take those sources and sort of reinterpret and say, okay, they present Cleopatra this way. In reality, it was probably more like this. And as I was saying when we were talking about Octavian's propaganda battle against Antony, regardless of to what extent you think Cleopatra had Antony sort of twirled around her finger, Antony was the one in charge, right? She was not some evil, scheming, witch who had taken Antony and made him un-Roman. This framing doesn't make sense. It is really moralistic too, right? There's no point framing it that way. She was clearly intelligent, and I think she was looking out for the interests of her kingdom, Egypt. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But there's a lot of stuff we don't know, so it is really difficult to make these sort of judgments, right? All we can do is use the information we have and try to interpret it in an accurate way as possible, basically.
Historians have treated Cleopatra so poorly.
Yeah.
In any case, now that our boy Octavian cleaned up at Actium, he annexed the Duat out of Egypt and did who knows what with the bodies of Antonius and Cleopatra, so the totally not a civil war was won, and Rome was finally at peace. Yay!
Hey!
Given the straight century of world-spanning turmoil that Rome had just gone through, it should be no surprise that people were really glad about this. And
I think, honestly, the reign of Octavian, Augustus, who he will soon become, makes even more sense when you remember that Rome hasn't just been roiled by civil conflict since Caesar. It's been roiled by civil conflict, civil war for, like they said, about 100 years. I mean, Jesus. Now, that whole 100 years obviously hasn't been as intense as the last couple of years of the late Republic have. But even so, 100 years of civil conflict ranging from low level to full-on civil war, people are probably done, They just want some stability. And if that stability comes in the form of a unifying authoritarian, well, they'd rather take that than another civil war.
The years that followed, Octavian consolidated his power under the guise of restoring the Republic, even though most people knew and honestly didn't care because they were either just glad the wars were over or were among the 2/3 of the Senate that Octavian himself installed. Also, to mark his new position, he changed his name to Augustus, meaning the increased one, or majestic. He almost changed it to Romulus, presumably just to mess with historians, so let's be glad he didn't.
And of course, Caesar would become a title taken on by Roman emperors, and then Augustus would become a title taken on by Roman emperors. Really shows you the importance of these two fellas, Caesar and Augustus. Their influence is truly remarkable and truly lasts through the empire, though particularly Augustus. In terms of the Roman Empire itself and future Roman emperors, Augustus is the one that's really, really influential.
And that's the near immediate collapse of the triumvirate and the final war of the Roman Republic. Bottom line is that while Mark Antony was a very dangerous adversary who could have won had he paid more attention to his wits instead of his wife's, let's say, eyes, Octavian had the board tilted in his favor from day one. Not only was Octavian a superior strategist, but he had an exquisite team, finding by far the best general of the day in badass extraordinaire Marcus Agrippa, and winning a crucial propaganda war thanks to his friend Maecenas, Rome's biggest patron of poetry and the arts. As underhanded and downright brutal as some of his tactics were, Octavian's victory reassembled Rome into one piece, and critically demonstrated that perhaps the only way to keep it in one piece was to have one man in charge.
Yeah, I agree with this assessment. I mean, I think that Mark Antony definitely could have won. It wasn't inevitable that he would lose, and both Mark Antony and Octavian had the will. They had that dog in them, you know. I think Octavian is seen as more calculating, cold, and brutal, but Mark Antony could certainly be brutal too. But Octavian had a lot of advantages. He had the advantage of being smarter. Now, you know, that's a little silly, but he was just better at this sort of political maneuvering than Antony was. I think Octavian was also better at seeing the big picture. Not to mention Octavian, who wasn't great at military affairs. This is probably one of the biggest gaps between him and Mark Antony. Octavian was terrible at military stuff. Antony was great. Well, Octavian had Agrippa, who they referred to as the greatest military mind of the day, which is probably true, right? Agrippa was exceedingly talented, very much ahead of his time. He put forth strategies that his enemies really couldn't read. So with those advantages, it makes sense how Octavian came out as the victor. Not to mention, he was appointed the official heir of Caesar. You know, he is who Caesar named in his will, not Mark Antony. So Octavian had a lot of advantages. I think Mark Antony, if he had maybe paid more attention, behaved a little more intelligently, more strategically, he could have won. But that is not what happened.
And after coming this far, there was no way Augustus would let it be anyone else. Part 3.
Okay. Now we get to a bit of uncharted territory. Augustus as emperor. We've done lots of videos on the late Republican era, Caesar's assassination, Octavian versus Mark Antony. Now we get to something that we have only covered very lightly, which is Octavian's time as emperor of Rome, his time as Augustus.
At barely 35 years old, Octavian Caesar, the great-nephew of one prematurely perforated Julius, was the most powerful man in Rome. In the span of a decade and a half, the impressive young man, as Cicero called him, cleverly swayed the people to view him as the rightful heir to the legacy of his father, Julius Caesar, and struck up an alliance with the prominent general Marcus Antonius to secure his revenge against the Big C's assassins. From there, he spent the next decade consolidating his power in the Western Republic, casting his co-triumvirate Marcus Antonius as a turncoat slave to his mistress Cleopatra. Because she was queen of the last non-Roman corner of the Mediterranean, and come on, it wasn't going to conquer itself. After waging and winning a war against the both of them, Egypt got annexed and the Roman Republic was pacified by the might of Octavian, now known by the name Augustus. But there was still one issue. We've been here before, and if things were going to change, what needed to be done next?
That is exactly right. And this is why Augustus is so impressive and influential. We've been here before. We've been in a similar, not the same, but a similar position with Caesar, Augustus's adopted father. What will Augustus do differently? That is the question, because there's a chance that he could go the same way as Caesar, right? He's in a powerful but risky position. And so the things that Augustus does differently, how he manages to build his position, that is why he becomes so influential.
And how could the Republic really be restored if there's one man clearly more powerful than anyone else? Well, as we'll see, even though the road to the Roman Empire wasn't the most obvious, Augustus, ever the clever little son of a god, pulled it off. First things first, when he returns to Rome from yoinking Egypt, he astutely dodged the subject of whether or not he was going to make like his old man and fashion himself a king. Instead, he pulled a Bane and insisted that he was restoring the Republic and returning it to you, the people. Indeed. I'm Bane. Anyway, and since Augustus had already offed the other two triumvirs, he ditched the now awkward title and resigned most of his official power.
Yes, we already see a difference from Caesar. Now, at the beginning of the Civil War with Pompey, Pompey is often seen as someone who was defending the Republic, and Caesar someone who was destroying the Republic. I think that framing is kind of unfair. In many ways, Pompey was also an authoritarian who didn't care about the Republic. Anyway, during that era, Caesar did try to claim the title of Defender of the Republic for himself, as, sort of ridiculous as that might seem. But as Caesar defeats Pompey, he becomes the sole ruler of Rome. Caesar really left that behind. He made a lot of decisions and took a lot of actions that painted him as basically an aspiring monarch, someone who was becoming a king in all but name. And of course, people were fearful that soon it would be king in name, that he would take the position of the king of Rome. He would leave the Republic behind entirely. And that is one of the things that made him unpopular, particularly amongst the Senate. Now, Caesar did remain popular amongst the people, but even the people did not like these authoritarian power grabs. And honestly, I think Caesar being murdered did a wonder for his reputation. If he had been allowed to survive, he probably would have gotten less and less popular as he became closer and closer to a king. Him being murdered, people tend to forget sometimes about the bad things and remember the good things Caesar did. Augustus, on the other hand, though he was just as, if not more authoritarian than Caesar, and throughout his reign he would hold far more power than Caesar did, Augustus was very clear to everybody that I'm just restoring the Republic. I'm giving up all of my official positions. I don't want to be an emperor. I don't want to be a king. I just want to be someone who's restored the Republic so we can go back to how things used to be. Now, whether or not that was convincing, I'm not entirely sure, but it was a game Augustus played, and I think it worked relatively well for him. I mean, he seems to have at least given people the impression that he respected the Roman way of doing things, and at the very least, he was able to make the Senate relatively happy.
But he did stay on as consul and remained the effective governor of Egypt, Spain, Gaul, Syria, and Illyria. So he had insane funds, lots of territory, and most of Rome's legions in his pocket.
Yes, so, I'm not an emperor, I'm not a king, but I will hold on to some of our most powerful provinces.
And that would make for some large pockets. It's like Pokemon, but instead it's just lots of humans, land, and coins in a giant burlap sack. He also took on the generally ceremonial role of princeps senatus, but since Octavian had stacked the Senate in his favor over the past few years, it effectively meant that he dictated legislation. That was basically his trick. He never changed.
Yes. And princeps, as I said, a ceremonial position, will become an important title for someone like Augustus. It will sort of take on a new meaning.
Any core institutions. He just happens to hold several different key positions of extreme power all at once. The totalitarianism was a total accident. Whereas the big C rolled into Rome like, what up, I'm dictator for life, and got immediately murdered because...
Exactly, they're making the point that I did. Caesar rolled up into Rome basically a king. Now, he refused the crown and he made a bit of effort to say, I'm not a king, totally not. But his actions, and even what he said, it was pretty clear that he was the ruler of Rome, and he saw himself in that way. That was Caesar's big mistake. I think he really let his success go to his head, because Caesar had always been good at appealing to the people. He'd always been good at PR, marketing himself and his accomplishments, and... in his final years, his time as, the one and sole strongman of Rome, he really didn't do a great job of presenting himself as anything but an aspiring monarch.
His plot armor wasn't as strong as he thought, Augustus was much more aware of feelings on the ground and played himself up as a peacebringer above everything else. So at this point, no one had the reason, and especially not the means, to start another civil war. Half a decade into his not-quite rule over his not-quite empire, the Senate gave its official thumbs up to his peace-bringing, republic-restoring, Pax Romana securing ways. And after that, there were statues of Augustus going up everywhere, and coins bearing his face, and a shield on the Senate House with an inscription about how full of justice and piety he is... Okay, nuts. Point taken. He's definitely a king. But no, Romans saw a good king in practice but not in name as vastly preferable to the stabby alternative. 100 years of civil war will do that to you. The closest brush...
And of course, it's worth remembering that Augustus is in a different position to Caesar. I mean, the difference in their experiences isn't just due to Augustus handling it better than Caesar did. You have to remember that Augustus, of course, also has the experience of Caesar to learn from. He can look at what his adopted father did and say, I'm not going to do that. He can learn from Caesar's mistakes, not to mention, by the time Augustus came to power, the Republic had been through several more years of intense civil war, not low-level, intense, all-consuming civil war, complete chaos. So Augustus was also dealing with similar but different circumstances than Caesar was.
With rebellion happened a few years into the empire, where a prefect of Egypt named Cornelius Gallus won a small campaign and erected a monument to his victory. Augustus, visibly shaken by the wave of flashbacks to Antony and Cleopatra, mailed Gallus a letter of stern reprimand and then also a dagger for which to impale himself. Gallus, guilty of little more than pride and governing while Alexandrian, went down without a fight. After that, Rome collectively kept its mouth shut, and Augustus kept a very keen eye on Egypt.
As they're saying here, Egypt was very precious to its new Roman rulers, its administration, economy, and culture, had a several hundred-year head start on Rome, wealthiest province outside of Italy, and produced a vast amount of food. Egypt was seen, after it was taken by Rome, as the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. Beforehand, that was Sicily. Sicily produced a lot of the food to feed Rome. After Egypt was taken, Egypt produced a massive amount of food that would head to the rest of the empire and feed the inhabitants, not to mention, like they are pointing out here, like some of the other eastern provinces, like, say, the Greek states, Egypt had an incredibly established, powerful culture, administration, economy, its own impressive history. And that's one of the reasons why it was so important and it was so powerful, not to mention, though under Cleopatra, Egypt was still a vassal of Rome. Basically, it was kind of a puppet, and it had been for a while. It was still an independent state with some autonomy. So for all of these reasons, you can see why Egypt was pretty important.
On the foreign front, Augustus expanded Rome's borders to more or less what they'd be for the next
Look
few
at that!
centuries. He also secured a peace deal with the Parthians, who had been a particularly troublesome thorn in Rome's side for almost a century, as I'm sure Crassus would tell you if he didn't have gold poured down his throat.
Yes, well, there's a lot of stories about what the Parthians did to Crassus. We don't exactly know, but we do know that he had a bad time. His invasion went terribly, and I'm sure his end of life wasn't fun. I'll put it that way. We have the eternal rivalry between the Romans and the Persians. Took many different forms. I often think of the Byzantines and the Sassanid Persians, but, similar thing. It's just Romans and Persians in many different forms.
On the domestic side, the princeps selected senators, magistrates, and generals to keep everything running smoothly. This allowed him to just go nuts on public works. He subsidized hundreds of temples, including the symbolism-rich Forum of Augustus, which, fun fact, became the go-to place to show off treasures from a campaign, so in later centuries it became too crowded with spoils to even walk through. He also funded...
Yeah, and, this is one of the things that Roman emperors would really adopt and do in the future. As I said, Augustus was incredibly influential. He really provided the model that emperors after him would follow. He was the first to do it, and he was also one of the greatest, if not the greatest. We can think of, for more contemporary examples, say, the American government and the presidency with someone like George Washington. A lot of the things Washington did, he set the standard for those who would follow. Exactly the same thing here. And this whole thing of building public works, building temples, bathhouses, gladiatorial arenas, this is something that a lot of emperors would do in order to make the people happy. There's the common phrase of bread and circuses, right? You can interpret it as cynically as you want to, but this was something that would be repeated time and time again.
Agrippa's pantheon. the Pantheon, a structure that, much like Agrippa himself, is so impressive it's almost insulting.
Yeah, although Augustus did an incredible amount of building. He reigned for a long time, and he put a lot of effort into infrastructure, more than a lot of other emperors. And so not only was he influential and that those who came after him would follow him, but if you're a Roman living in the city, however long after Augustus, and you can walk around the city and see all of these temples and structures put up by the great Emperor Augustus, that is going to keep his legacy alive. And, it did keep his legacy alive.
The gorgeous ocular dome is made of poured concrete, and the light from that oculus shines through the front door on the anniversary of Rome's founding. Agrippa, dude, I get that you're cooler than all of us, but you don't have to rub our faces in it all the time. Come on. On the literary front, Augustus had his poets working in high gear to crank out some of Rome's best literature. Given what came before, that was a low bar to clear, but this new stuff was pretty sweet. It probably goes without saying that the most famous Augustan-era work is Virgil's Aeneid, a masterful epic poem glorifying Rome's ancient Trojan history. And while
the Romans always took a lot of notes from the Greeks. Whether you talk about their pantheon of gods, just taken from the Greeks, their culture, their literature, philosophy, whatever. They looked at what the Greeks did, they said, that's great, let's just do that. And so, the bar for, Roman literature was rather low, but at this point, with the reign of Augustus and the beginning of the Roman Empire, we really see the emergence of a new sort of golden age of Roman culture, Roman literature, Roman philosophy, etc., etc. Still, by the way, incredibly influenced by the Greeks. You're talking about the classical ancient world. You really cannot avoid Greek influence. But here we see this new era of Roman prosperity. And with that prosperity comes a lot of things like culture.
Slides in a non-negligible number of digs at his boss, the Aeneid was still a key component of the so-called Augustan program in the arts, literature, and architecture. The celebration of just how dang glorious Rome was and the coolness of Augustus for making Rome its best self. The saying, Augustus found Rome a city of bricks and left it a city of marble, isn't strictly true, but it's no secret that Rome was a cultural backwater in Caesar's day compared to, say, Alexandria, and Augustus did a lot to make Rome a place that didn't entirely suck to actually.
Yeah, he founded a city of bricks, left it a city of marble. Don't take it literally, but metaphorically, there is absolute truth to that. Augustus did a lot to cement Roman power and build the city of Rome up to a cultural powerhouse of the ancient world. Of course, this is a process that would continue long beyond Augustus, but a lot of this stuff can be attributed to him and the work he did and the processes that he started. It's really, really difficult to overestimate how important Augustus was, and I feel like he's kind of underrated. He doesn't get enough attention for all of the stuff he did for the empire. And, regardless of your opinion on Augustus, I think there's a lot you can critique him for, particularly in his pre-Augustus days, but even while he's emperor. Look, I'm no fan of an authoritarian style of government, right? Despite that, whatever you think about him, you cannot deny all he did for Rome, all he did for the empire, the changes he brought, all the processes he started that would come to fruition later. He really is super, super important to the history of Rome.
Live in. However, it wasn't all smiles in Augustan Rome, as the poet Ovid needs to be absolutely certain you are aware. The short of it is that Augustus tried to impose new laws on marriage, so our boy Ovid decided to write a giant poem about where and how to seduce any man or woman in Rome.
Yes, so the Julian laws, Augustus's attempt to regulate and legislate morality, were very unpopular. I think just a bad idea. I'm still not entirely sure why Augustus went for this. Augustus has a very high political IQ. You think he would know what would be popular and unpopular. So I think this must be something that he just genuinely wanted to do. He wanted to regulate Roman morality. And I generally think that legislation like this, an attempt to regulate people's individual decisions, regulate their morality, it usually doesn't work because, of course, societies usually have some sort of common morality that they share, but people have different opinions on things. They make different decisions. They have different individual senses of morality, particularly in an empire as diverse and large as Rome. And so I just think it's not a great idea to try and regulate that past a certain point. And we're talking about stuff like, they're saying adultery was outlawed, citizens had legal and tax incentives to bear more children, widows were legally required to remarry, other restrictions on marriage. A lot of this is just trying to legislate people's individual decisions. And, before you say, well, Ethan, you can't apply your modern ideas to ancient Rome. No, these laws were incredibly unpopular at the time. They mention that right here. The Romans a lot of them were not paragons of virtue, I hate to break it to you. And a lot of them did not like these laws. They probably felt the same way about them that I do, that they're sort of pointless, ineffective, and a bad idea.
As it happens, the how often involved seducing the maid first, which I don't quite follow, but Rome was a different place, so who knows, and the where was pretty much every monument Augustus built. Unsurprisingly, the new emperor was less than pleased at the thought of these wild youths using his carefully crafted highbrow iconography as set dressing for casual hookups, and Ovid got exiled to the Black Sea for the rest of his life. Coincidentally, Augustus also exiled his own daughter at the same time. One and two may or may not have gone together, but it would have been completely in character for that salacious Ovid. One successful empire later, Augustus died in 14 AD at the age of 75. By the time he died, almost no one could remember what the Old Republic was like, either because they were too young or too murdered.
Yep, that's exactly right. Augustus reigned for a while, and so that's exactly true. A lot of people couldn't remember a time before the empire because they were simply too young. Or they had been killed, or those who did remember a time before Augustus remembered a time of chaos, violence, and warfare. So if this is the situation you're in, you're going to have a lot of people who, regardless of their critiques of Augustus, probably feel pretty positive about him and this new era of prosperity that he's brought.
Although Augustus was one of Rome's longest-serving emperors, he suffered from a recurring sickness that almost killed him every other year. Yeah, throughout this whole process, not only did he have to contend with Brutus, Cassius, and Antony trying to kill him, he also had to, not die to RNG.
It's remarkable that he reigned for more than 40 years, considering how sickly he was. I mean, he was a very sickly individual as a child, but throughout his entire life. And that illness would get in the way sometimes. They would particularly get in the way of, say, military campaigning. Though, as we've talked about, Augustus was not a fan of military campaigning. And whenever there's an instance in history of, Augustus got sick, he can't go, of course people think, well, was he actually sick or did he just not want to go? We're not quite sure. But it's honestly really impressive that he managed to accomplish all of this and do it while his constitution was not very good. He had to deal with pretty frequent illness.
And speaking of dying, his heirs weren't quite so lucky. See, being emperor and all, Augustus wanted to choose a successor, so he groomed his nephew Marcellus to become emperor, but then he died.
Yeah, Augustus begins the timeless Roman tradition of, ruling as a great emperor and then really struggling to secure the heir you want, to more or less levels of success. There seems to really be a tradition in Roman politics of great emperors being followed either by bad heirs who may be blood related, or great emperors, somehow failing or not being able to appoint the heir they wanted.
Well, that's Roman medicine for you. So then he started preparing his stepson Drusus, and nope, he's dead too.
Yep.
Okay, how about his two grandkids Gaius and Lucius? And are you kidding me? So with options A through D...
Augustus really had one of the worst times, though. The thing is, there are a number of, good to great Roman emperors who really just didn't give much thought to succession, and so that can sort of be placed on them. You cannot accuse Augustus of that. He thought about succession. He thought about it all the time. He was making an immense effort to train an heir that would come after him. He just got really unlucky, frankly.
Exhausted, succession went to his wife Livia's first son Tiberius. With the benefit of hindsight, a terrible choice, but options were slim, so what'll you do? Well, historians have written about Augustus up and down the timeline. He made their jobs a bit easier by writing not quite an autobiography, but a pretty thorough resume. Upon his death, he published the Res Gestae Divi Augusti, basically the awesome stuff I did. Some of it is embellished, some of it is straight up lies, but it shows what he thinks mattered most about himself, and it was the stability he brought to Rome. Between the senator murdering and the human...
And the stability he brought to Rome was, I think, his most impressive achievement. He shares that view, and I think he's absolutely right. He did so much other stuff, but really the most impressive achievement is after 100 years of, almost constant civil strife and a particular period of intense civil war, Augustus brought peace to Rome and prosperity to Rome for decades. That really is his most impressive achievement, and one that he would be remembered for, and that clearly he felt was important too.
Sacrificing, it's fair to say that Augustus is a little problematic, and the moderate amount of deception underpinning his entire career is also a bit distressing, but the Romans weren't about to argue with results. Through a long career of carefully strategized political maneuvering, military operations, and cultural production, Augustus laid the groundwork for over 1,000 more years of Rome, and that's a feat.
Yeah, that's a pretty impressive achievement, and he really did. It's not a situation of, oh, he was the first, so he gets remembered. Nuh-uh-uh. It's a situation of your first guy was really the one suited for the job. Like, I used the example of George Washington because he's kind of the same. Augustus really set the position up for those to follow. Now, his successor wasn't a great choice, but he kind of got unlucky. Emperors in the future would look back on Augustus and attempt to emulate him. He was so successful, so influential, that they wanted to copy what he did. And I think rightfully so. So yeah, now, of course, Augustus did a lot of bad stuff. That's undeniable. Not just stuff that we would recognize as bad today, but, stuff that was unpopular at the time. These political purges, people were horrified by them. They really were. This isn't just us imposing our view of morality onto these ancient people. They felt the same way about a lot of this. Augustus was brutal. He was someone who very much believed in the ends justify the means, right? He was willing to do whatever it took to get what he wanted, and sometimes it took brutality. Really, it did. Violence, murder, purges, confiscation of property, all that kind of stuff Augustus did. So this is not to say that he's an uncomplicated figure, or that he's a solely good figure. I don't even think it's about good or bad. It's just he was incredibly influential, and I think it's hard not to recognize him for his intelligence, his skill, and his influence. That's my opinion, at least.
His ascent to power was far from guaranteed, but this 19-year-old kid outplayed all of Rome, and one metric history summarized later, this kid was a 75-year-old man who is now also dead.
Yep.
So, with the age of Augustus finished, onward to empire. Thank you so much for watching.
Onward to empire. And please go and check out OSP's video. It's linked in the description. Go and give them a like, show them support. Fantastic video. I gotta say, we've done a couple of OSP videos at this point. I believe this is our fourth. I could be wrong. We do them every once in a while, but every time I react to one of their videos, it is just a great experience. I really like how they present history, how they frame things, the information they give. I think they do a really excellent job, also of making it accessible and entertaining. And whenever I react to their videos, I always talk for a long, long time because I just, have a lot to say, and their videos are a big part of that. So yeah, excellent content. Please go and check out their channel. If you guys enjoyed this reaction, then please leave a like, comment, check out the Patreon, which is linked down below. Check out our Discord. Our channel has a Discord. We talk about a lot of stuff. We talk a lot about Roman history, so if you want to see that, then please go check out the Discord. That's also in the description. I don't have much more to say about Augustus. I definitely said what I was thinking throughout this video. A complicated figure, but one who was very skilled and very, very influential. And I'm glad I'm getting more of an opportunity to talk about him. You know, there's a lot of Rome content on YouTube. A lot of it is focused on the late Republican period, particularly on Caesar. I mean, Caesar gets an absolute massive amount of attention. And this isn't just true on YouTube, this is true in general. Books, TV shows, culture in general. There's a massive focus on Caesar, and I think someone like Augustus doesn't always get the attention he deserves. So I'm glad we got to do this video. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, all of that said and done, I hope you guys are having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.